What an introduction. I don't know about you, but yikes, I was a bit shocked at those numbers, and I think it's quite hard hitting. In all due respect, if I may say that, and it's definitely, unfortunately, it's all around us, and unfortunately, we sometimes turn a blind eye when we don't mean to. So thank you, Professor Lashley. Now, for our next speaker, I really hate reading from the program. I do apologise. However, I can't find better words to introduce this next speaker than what is written here, because I've tried to define it as much as I can. However, I really think it is so fitting for what you do. Our next speaker is Irina, please, I hope I pronounced this right, Irina Todorova. Very good, I got it right. And Irina serves as a senior regional specialist on the counter-trafficking and assistance to vulnerable migrants for the International Organization for Migration, and is based in Brussels. She deals with lots of projects with the EU member states and the EU institutions. And today is obviously going to talk about slavery and what is it today. So please, without further ado, Ms. Todorova.
Thank you. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting us. And I think the value of partnership and cooperation between different actors, I think, has been given globally, but also within the EU in the recent years. And I very often here, I decided to call it modern phases of trafficking, but I think what de facto I usually also say it's different phase or new phase and old pain. Yeah, but I will try to introduce the changes that the phenomena has. So I will speak a little bit about the trends, because our main say in counter-trafficking or about the phenomena is based on actual cases we assist. Yeah, we hold our case management system is around 100,000 cases. Yeah, so we know about trafficking from people we assist. I will say a few words about trafficking trends within the EU, and then focus a little bit, if I have time, on some responses, and will prioritize those that we try to offer and engage with private sector. So traditionally, trafficking was looked at and developed as a response to trafficking of women and girls. And I would say over a decade now, we still see that women and girls are still most vulnerable, but there are more men and boys. And I must say the systems that have been developed to address and offer rehabilitation services to women is struggling to offer assistance to men. So you see the proportionality and how things changed, yeah? Which means a lot that the sector that as counter-trafficking had specialized on services for women had to really now readjust and be able to offer assistance and help to men and boys. The average age here I show over years, and I think the significant feature is that if, let's say, when I joined IOM back in 2004, predominantly we were seeing girls and women between the age of 16 and 24, very young. Now you see that we can come across any age, yeah, and I think this is a challenge, but on average, let's say 50% of victims that we assisted in the between 2006 and 2016 are between the age of 22 and 37. Then we talked about children, and I think what we see, especially within the EU region, because globally in IOM statistics, let's say those that are being identified or found, yeah, as victims of trafficking and referred to our assistance programs, usually we have 10 or 15% of children only. Yeah, within the EU region, it's on increase, and children are targeted much more. It's much easier to control. Criminal groups think it's worth investing. Yeah, they're very can be easily invisible, they can run away. So, so we reach up to 30% within the EU region. Then We try to also analyze a little bit by average time in exploitation, yeah, and you see by sort of, let's say, if we speak about two main groups, trafficking for labor exploitation and sexual exploitation, between also men and women, because there is a gender dimension also in a sense in which sector, yeah, women, girls, or men and boys are trafficked. But on average, yeah, it's sort of 2 years, around 2 years. So then, who are sort of the perpetrators of trafficking process? And children are most often controlled through false promises, deception, physical, psychological abuse, sexual abuse, yeah, and threats to the individual. And then adults are more controlled through excessive hours, yeah, withholding wages and ID, denying medical treatment, and debt bondage. Debt bondage, I would say, stayed within trafficking as one of the characteristics or feature very long. And I would say within the migrant and refugee crisis recently, yeah, everyone was saying, okay, what would be the early sign of trafficking maybe among those that have been smuggled? And I think the moment it starts with a debt bondage, it's likely to end up as trafficking. But debt bondage, let's say in Asia, it's a huge thing. They indebt the whole families, yeah? They take out land and property. So when we in the EU, let's say, identify victims from Asia, they do not exit. And I think this is where our partnership is extremely important if we do things ethically, because it's very difficult to victims of labor exploitation to offer an alternative, because none of the programs, unless then the private sector will take or employer this responsibility and facilitate access to remedy, it's almost impossible for a charity or even state-run program to really cover the needs. Then more about perpetrators. We also saw a huge shift, let's say, for recruiters and traffickers being complete strangers, yeah, to people, and then more, I think, trafficking internalizes itself in order to prevent from reporting, yeah, and we see more and more close family and friends, and I think it's very painful to recognize, but it's huge pressure then on victims themselves. How do you report a family? It's again the morality, I think, and the ethics being exploited, including religion and customs traditions. So then a little bit about the proportionality, let's say, of different categories of victims between sexual and labor exploitation. Lately within IOM globally, we have in our assistance programs actually almost 50-50 men and women and boys and girls, although within EU region, women are still predominant. And there might be different reasons for that. I think we're still struggling within the counter-trafficking community or police, and there is lately labor inspectors, and actually Netherlands during the presidency really made a focus, let's say, zoomed on trafficking for labor exploitation and what labor inspectors could do together with police. But what happens lately, also in trying to reduce the number of those staying, under the Employer Sanction Directive, for example, those that are being identified, let's say, in black labor market, migrants are being immediately deported. So they are not offered assistance and protection or recognized as victims. And I think this shows how maybe insufficient policies and services applied in practice. Then here a little bit to see for you how maybe over the 10 years that are presented here, things changed for men and women. Men are still predominantly exploited and trafficked to for the purpose of labor exploitation. For women, things slightly change, but sometimes it's just to have a cover up, because majority of women that are trafficked for labor exploitation would be victims of combined exploitation and would have associated with it sexual exploitation. But you see that proportionality slightly changed. We have more or diversification of exploitation for women, but for men the trend is quite steady. Here, let's say there are two graphs showing a little bit the changes for children, yeah, and female child victims and male victims. So for boys, the sexual exploitation is on the rise, yeah, and I think we are also looking into academia to try to see what would be the right strategy, you know, to facilitate rehabilitation or exit from this. There are a lot of survival strategies, yeah, sort of survival sex nowadays, and also within Europe, and I think it's a huge challenge. For girls, I would say that there is a growing trend for more use in labor exploitation, but sexual exploitation sort of remains predominant. Then sectors, yeah, there is factory work, agriculture, domestic work, and commercial sex. And here you see two graphs that compare a little bit the distribution, yeah, or between men and women, between the different sectors, and the child and adults, sort of how they vary between sectors. And I would say children a lot are being used within the EU for criminal activity. It started with petty crimes, and now the crimes sort of are growing. Within the EU, huge sector is agriculture, construction, and actually hospitality. So, and I'm very happy that you dedicate these 2 days to discuss actions within this. So I will skip a few, just showing here a little bit that the proportions are different. I said globally we assist more or less 50-50 between victims of labor exploitation and sexual exploitation, and within the EU, 85% are still women. At the same time, there is a trend that we did a little bit the analysis here I did for you between sexual exploitation, adult men, adult women. But let's say what is significant that among men, predominantly they are used for labor exploitation, and prevalence, there is recently a trend of prevalence of men, EU citizens. We have another feature here, yeah, because we are used, I think, traditionally when we speak about trafficking, this is something outside EU. And I think then when EU has put first time the report together and saw that actually there are a lot of victims, EU citizens, and I think it came a little bit of a surprise, but I believe it also gave a slight push to maybe look at counter-trafficking policies and laws and maybe revamp a little bit the response. Recruitment methods. What also changed, I think, and especially within the EU, the role of intermediaries. And I think it was mentioned by Professor that what is being done, usually we could see that there was no relationship between employer and those working for them, but there was a relationship, a direct relationship only between the recruitment agency. And then it was very difficult for police to identify it as trafficking or for labor inspectors to do inspection of sites and things like that. So I think there are a lot of trafficking is always associated. If we try to regulate, we need to pay attention what and how we regulate, because wherever there are gaps, it will be used by criminal groups. Okay, here I just wanted to say and invite you, when you have time, my presentation will be available to show that also within the raising awareness, yeah, or trying to reach out to general public, because I think sometimes the raising awareness campaigns were too specialized, let's say, or not very well targeted. And I think that lately there is a huge also cooperation between academia and practitioners on trafficking. What triggers change in behavior? And I think, I like in UK, they say if you look, basically this video shows, if you look, you find. Another engagement, we engaged with Nordic-Baltic partnership with passenger ferry companies. And at first we had a more classical entry for cooperation with them, because we thought maybe the passenger ferries are used to transport victims. Yeah, so we thought let's train staff to be able to early identify. But what this partnership brought, when we had, after revising sort of with management of some of the passenger ferries, they said, we actually would like to look at our supply chain, about our subcontractors, who does the laundry for our services on board and things like that. Because, I mean, huge passenger ferries, they're like sitting on water. Yeah, so, and we're very happy, like from one initiative, we could work actually on a more systematic and institutional level of companies. I will skip, we would have a segment on working with victims, and I could contribute maybe from the floor. But taking us back, because a lot of labor exploitation or trafficking for labor exploitation, there was the role of intermediaries. Then we, as IOM, tried to look together. I represent Migrant Assistance Division. Together with Labor Migration and Human Development Division, we tried to look what can we do about or around ethical recruitment. And these are some of the prerequisites why recruiters drive to increase profits that may lead to unsound and fraudulent practices. Yeah, already during the recruitment phase, migrant workers may face a risk of violations of their rights, and there is a need to protect migrant workers by establishing orderly and well-controlled recruitment process. Yeah, because I think the tendency of evolution within the counter-trafficking response also, we can't work at the level of consequences. We have to start doing something more proactive, and this is how we saw our work. What could be the consequences of unethical recruitment? And here you see sort of how they are associated, and risks for employers and also risks for migrants. Yeah, so high recruitment fees, leading to that bondage, false promises, document and property retention, contract substitution. This happens a lot, yeah? And when we engaged with embassies, they said no, the paperwork was fine, but only later they were made aware that contracts are being substituted. The moment work permit, yeah, with visa is issued, the contract would be substituted, and people usually would sign already only in foreign language without their national language, which at the beginning, so I just show how things can go wrong, and there are limits to where you can protect yourself, plus you might have also different level of education. Then negative impacts for employers, skills mismatch and poor retention, yeah, occupational health and safety issues, links to criminal smuggling and human trafficking networks. Sometimes when we offered to do sort of a social audit of the supply chain, things were discovered that management, let's say senior management, couldn't imagine, or that this is happening within their business. Government fines, prosecution, non-compliance, yeah, with client codes of conduct, and possibility for reputational damage. And I would say under this pillar, a lot of cooperation starts, yeah, lately with private sector, but then we can go and promote more change. So traditional two strands, yeah, of work: direct involvement of state and self-regulation. But I want just to give an example of regulating by state. There was a recruitment agency that was recruiting, let's say, 500 people, and everyone had to pay as first fee or part or at the initial stage 1,000. Then the company disappears. People who paid this money can't find. When we reached out to the country where they were supposed to go, the certification authority or licensing, they say exactly this year was the first year where this recruitment company didn't come and submit for extension of certification, sort of confirmation of license. But they said, we don't have the responsibility to go and find out why. Yeah, so it was then very difficult to bring any sort of remedy to these people. So, yeah, and self-regulation, code of conduct, but I must say it works, but it works to a certain level, yeah? It again requires. So what then we developed, we engage, of course, with member states, yeah, through regional consultation processes, and now we're living in a moment where it's very significant, let's say for us as IOM, but overall for states, the Global Compact on Migration, negotiation, and Global Compact on Refugees. So I think it just shows that migration and mobility of people have been recognized as a global issue and now is being discussed within this framework. So hopefully more positive outcomes would come. Then capacity building and training, technical assistance to improve regulatory framework, increasing knowledge base through research and publications, and direct assistance to migrants. And I want to say here something that also Professor said before. Working on counter-trafficking is highly political. You won't be able to achieve anything if you don't have political will. Businesses. We our latest developments and tools that we engaged already for some time, so-called due diligence tools. One is IRIS, maybe some of you've heard, is International Recruitment Integrity System. It basically a little bit an attempt of self-regulation initiative, among ethical recruiters, let's say, or bring them together and develop standards and have a voluntary certification system. We try within these initiatives to promote the employer pays principle, to leave less space for fraudulent or unsound policies. Then labor supply chain mapping and analysis. This we offer a lot, and we have some successes, and we hope that to be able to implement it at a higher scale. Training on migration impacts for policymakers, social auditors, for migrants, let's say, those that are being recruited to work within the supply chains. We try to have programs pre-departure and post-arrival. I think sometimes, especially for me, I'm now working in Europe for almost 5 years. I think we a priori expect that people know how to claim their rights, but I think it's very new. Then it's not everyone imagines that there will be someone who would help or will be interested. And as was mentioned, I think if everything is left to individual, let's say, and capacity to stand up for your rights, I think for some nations, I mean, it's a far way to go, so they would need support frameworks. And then leading multi-stakeholder dialogues. Another initiative that we just now piloted for 1.5 years, we called it IOM's Corporate Responsibility in Eliminating Slavery and Trafficking. It has 3 pillars, training on slavery and trafficking, because usually as part of a dialogue, or you can go deeper if there is a good understanding what it is, how it may happen, then the pillar focusing on migrants themselves, and then supply chain mapping and ethical recruitment support. So here we actually also try to develop, even if you try to set up institutionally, you have codes of conduct, you have framework, but where we are lacking is how one accesses remedy, or if wrongdoing was identified, what should be the process, especially for multilateral company, it's not very easy to follow through the whole thing, so here, but we see a lot of interest for this engagement and a lot of support. A little bit more maybe on IRIS. So it's absolutely voluntary multi-stakeholder certification system. We started this initiative in coordination with other agencies and specifically ILO as well, but also with International Employer Organization. We wanted to have somebody on board. But I noticed that from country to country or region to region, let's say, businesses have also different relationship or perception of umbrella organizations, because sometimes maybe also the interests differ, or not many that are, let's say, ethical businesses would like to be associated with necessarily the umbrella organization, within their sector. So when we stepped in here, we also thought we could bring maybe some dialogue and find out, but it's still easier sometimes to start with an umbrella and then go down. So here that it's designed for workers, yeah, so there are benefits for labor recruiters and also for employers. So in a way, all stakeholders could profit in one way or another. What is interesting maybe, and we could be in touch because it's now reaching more or less its pilot phase, and we thought it's worth piloting it here, so, and within the hospitality sector, maybe we could be in touch somewhere in the second half and look at some possibilities of cooperation. Here is just, I also invite to visit. There is a huge campaign in Asia because I think the scale of trafficking or labor exploitation or just instances of forced labor are huge. So, and the campaign is called Learn, Act and Share, and you could find a lot of videos, a lot of testimonies, how things. Here a little bit about the times we're living, and I think it's good also maybe to look, because states do look at indicators or targets that they committed to address. And trafficking we can find, or exploitation, in 3 main targets, yeah, and I hope that this eventually, you see that, for example, 16.2 calls to end abuse, exploitation, trafficking, and all forms of violence against children. So it's an ambitious goal and target. Then New York Declaration that brings us in a way to Global Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. But what I wanted to say here, because there are sometimes also maybe some of you participate in advocacy around it, because it's being negotiated by June. What is good to see that there is an objective 10 that is dedicated to that, but then there are a number of other objectives around labor, migrant workers, and what are their rights and how things are respected for them. And I think it's very important because there seems to be a lot of consensus about work on counter trafficking and protecting victims, but I think it's a little bit late. It's important, but it's important that we don't work at the level of consequences only, but do a lot proactively. At the global level, and now within the different processes, this group, the Interagency Coordinating Group Against Trafficking in Persons, is recognized as a platform for global coordination, and I wanted to bring it here just to show that in order in this framework to agree together on something, it takes time, but I think there is much more effort to coordinate and work together, and I think this is what potentially will bring impact. Another new feature of counter-trafficking work that we are doing, because the recent or the number of unprecedented crises globally show that there are elements of crisis, and usually counter-trafficking is not part of the crisis response. And here the main findings are that existing trafficking types are exacerbated, new crisis-induced trafficking and exploitation appear, and then it should be associated or be part of from our onset. And I've seen how within the migrant and refugee crisis, because even if you had a classical counter-trafficking organization as part of response at entry-exit, but because the main task was humanitarian and immediate needs, identification of victims were coming only after. And this is the last initiative I wanted to show, and I hope that it would be maybe also useful for particularly the audience here, that we are engaging with OECD to develop practical guidance, because I think we have a lot and good international framework, or regional frameworks. But everything comes, how do you put it in application? So here we hope, based on OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and UN guiding principles on business and human rights, that sort of presents this framework of protect, respect, and remedy. But maybe still there are questions how to facilitate access to remedy. So we hope that this guidance will be also authoritative, maybe because we do it with OECD, and we could contribute our practical examples and make it work for migrants, and those that are being identified then could have this remedy and opportunity again to rebuild their life. Thank you.